And just to let everybody know, we have our committee members, which are Ms. Bota and Mr. Hendricks, and we also have Mr. Presidente here today, and Mr. Zuko, Mr. Robinson, and our illustrious controller, Mr. Glazer. We're going to start with a discussion in regards to the specific information about that we need for the budget, and we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Greedy.
Let me just, before you start,
Please.
let me just say that we're looking for information on the budget itself. So we want to know the surplus, if there's any, deficit. Think there may be some on the budget, the current budget, and if you can categorize the expenses, okay? Any options that you may give us for the closing the deficit, what you have, what you're thinking, and any other information that may serve us as we prepare, and as each department prepare for the budget, that may help us. Okay? So it gives you a clear idea of what we're looking for.
Very good, thank you. I will do some remarks to that degree based on what we're seeing in 2018 so far. And then Mr. Tom Beckett from NW Financial will have a few remarks to make as well, from his perspective, having looked over our finances for the last couple of months. As our financial advisor, he'll add some points to make to that. In 2017, the effective operating deficit of the city of Allentown was $3.7 million, and a large chunk of that actually came from the bill that you have for consideration tonight, moving the monies over from the general fund to the capital fund to deal with the accounting errors of many years ago. From an operational perspective, the city actually came pretty close to being in balance for 2017, and it was largely because we really constrained expenditures very well. Revenues came in okay, not great, but expenditures were contained quite significantly. I look at the first 7 months of 2018, and I'm going to refer just a little bit to the monthly report, but I know we're going to get to that in a little bit. Revenue collection for the first 7 months of the year has been very robust. We're even when accounting for the likely escrow payments that have to be made to the NIS, for which we've been collecting some funds, we're still talking about being nearly $4 million over in revenue in the first 7 months of the year compared to a year ago, and we had actually factored in to be about $4 million over in revenue compared with what we collected a year ago. So this is where we're at through July. Now, most of the major taxes have come in, of course, but our revenue collection has been very robust, and I'm very pleased to say that, particularly when it comes to business privilege tax, that it's been doing very well, and that some of the other taxes that we had projected for growth, like earned income tax, have been demonstrating that growth so far. So from the revenue side, I'm actually very happy with where things are coming in for a year in which we have drawn down on reserves again to the tune of about $3.9 million, and hoping that as a result of that, we will not have that big a deficit at the end of this year, and we've dealt with our accounting issues. So we're not going to have another surprise of having to shift money out of the general fund for another purpose at the end of 2018. On the expenditure side, things have been very well controlled so far. And we did, of course, move some expenditures over into the stormwater fund as a result of the stormwater fee and moving some employees over there. But our overall costs so far on the year, net of that, are almost exactly where they were through 7 months of the year in the general fund a year ago, which means we have done we're at 55% spending on personnel costs through the first 7 months of the year, which is 58% of the year. So we're containing that well. We have managed to constrain our costs on several of our other categories, including contract services coming in. So contract services are coming in a little bit bigger than they were a year ago, but we also have more budgeted for them this year. And overall, whereas we were at 53% of total spending in 2017, we're at 50% of budgeted spending for 2018 at this point. That gives me some sense that we're not going to spend as much as we had budgeted, and that $3.9 million deficit will not be that great at year's end. So the issue then becomes, how well do we constrain that? And we have some obviously plans in place, as with previous years, that as we get to September, and we will put moratoriums on putting out any new RFPs, et cetera, and new commitments of funds for major contract services, that we will constrain those expenses, I think, very effectively in the last quarter of the year. And I'm still hopeful that we're going to see a couple of the revenue boosts before the year's over. We just saw our third quarter or second quarter collections from the casino fee that came in. They're coming in higher than what we had forecast. We had forecast, I believe, right around 3.9 million to come in from the casino fees, and we're now right around 3.4, with still one more payment to go this year, so that will be a nice boost when the November payment comes in. So there are things both in terms of robust revenue and in terms of expenditure constraints that I think are very positive in limiting the size of our deficit this year. That being said, we entered 2018, as it says in the CAFR, that we had a cash balance in the general fund of a little over $13 million. Given that there are other commitments within those funds, I had never considered that we had that much available for general purposes for the general fund, and I'm still getting some verification data on that, but I think we have, I will still go along with what I've said before, that probably in the neighborhood of 7 million-ish is about what we have that is not committed to anything else in the fund, and that is effectively going to be our cash balance as we get to the end of 2018, will be in that $6 to $7 million range. That is leading into 2019, where, as you had seen when I presented the 5-year plan some weeks ago, that if we were to fund our budget as we do things completely at this stage, that we have expenses that come in about $4 million more than what our projected revenues are going to be, and this is a pretty good, reliable number at this point, given what our revenue collections are now pretty predictable at this stage. Obviously, if we don't spend as much as would be budgeted, we're going to end up saving a bit of that, but the way that the budget is built, if we were going to hire everyone that we want to hire, if we were going to continue to provide services at the level that they're currently being provided, it would be a good assumption that we have about 107 to 108 million coming in revenue next year, going up against about 112 million in expenditures. So we've got about a $4 million hole. And along those lines, I wanted to have Tom Beckett give another deep dive into what we've been doing from his review of things over the last couple of months, and I'm going to, just so you can hear another voice on the subject besides mine, let him communicate a bit of what he has been seeing. So without further ado, here is our City Financial Advisor from NW Financial, Tom Beckett.
Thanks, Brent, and it's nice to be here again. Since we started our engagement here with the City of Allentown, one of the first things the most important things that I do is to, as Brent says, take a deep dive into your financial statements and your cash flows. Take a look at what types of assets you have in terms of cash assets and fund balances. It was fortunate that at the time we were doing that and beginning our engagement, you came up for review, your rating came up for review by Moody's. They annually take a look at your credit and issue a report. And you probably all saw the news last week or the week before last that Moody's was able to maintain your existing rating at an A3, but they unfortunately put what's called a negative outlook on it. And that negative outlook is almost solely based on what Brent just explained, which is that you have a structural deficit of about $3 to $4 million a year going forward if nothing changes. And their constant question to me and to Brent in the process of reviewing that rating was, what's the plan? How is this going to change? That said, there's some enormously good things that are going on here. You've got a favorable national and local economy. You've got some activity coming online in terms of real estate in the NIS. Those are all very, very positive things, and they will, as they did this year, serve to buffer that $3 to $4 million structural deficit, but almost likely not eliminated. The rating agencies, and I'm going to say something that I probably shouldn't say, but the rating agencies will likely reduce your rating if the structural deficit is not addressed. You will go to a BBB category rating from the A3 category. You will probably go to an A- or even further with S&P. S&P has a slightly higher rating than Moody's. Now, the obvious question to ask there is how does that impact the city of Allentown? In the long term, it costs you a lot more to borrow when you're borrowing for capital. But in the short term, let's play this out for a minute. If you're eating into your $6 or $7 or $8 million of available cash to the tune of $3 to $4 million a year, in 2 years you won't have anything left. And it will cause you to have to borrow money every year to bridge the time between paying your employees and getting your real estate taxes and other taxes in. That's what's called a tax and revenue anticipation note. And it's generally a sign of a little bit of fiscal stress. So it will cost you additional money to be lower rated. There's no doubt about it. Seen it time and time again. So it is, I think, important to address it. It's none of this is new to anybody in the room here. Allentown, as any medium-sized city in the Commonwealth, has its particular challenges. And those challenges wax and wane over time, and they're reflected in your budget. So, and I think this is the start of a longer conversation, and I hope to be able to help you work through those.
Thank you, Mr. Becker and Mr. Hazel. Let's get a couple of questions and we'll open it up from my colleagues. One is, I hear you saying that we most likely are going to end up with a $3 to $4 million structural deficit. Okay, but you also said that we probably get about $3 to $4 million surplus. So, can you tell me a little bit about how that will happen? And then I'd like you to talk a little bit about how to eliminate the structural deficit.
Let's first of all, indeed, thank you, Councilman Green, speak to the issue about how we're trying to reduce our deficit for this year. And it's happening both in terms of increased revenue coming in, very robust collection of business privilege tax, the growth that we were anticipating in earned income tax is happening. Very encouraging signs as far as that goes, and a couple of the other things that are rather large revenue items that we get from the casino fee coming in above expectations, and the EMS transit fees coming in pretty well for the first 7 months of the year. So revenue is having a big impact on that. And no doubt we are also constraining how much we're spending. That if it ends up being something similar to last year, and practically speaking, the $3.9 million deficit might come out something closer to being in balance. But part of what causes that to be in balance is that we have a lot of vacancies that are still existing in personnel. Plus, we are running through the first 7 months of last year. The vacancy factor for positions in the city totaled $991,000. For the first 7 months of 2018, the vacancy factor is in excess of $1.2 million. Yeah, it's a way in which we save money. It also means that we don't have as many people who we have budgeted for to be in certain positions in the city, and that goes across all departments. Obviously, we're down about 12 patrolmen from what would be a full complement at this point of police, and it's happening in a few other places in the city. And yeah, you can end up getting savings that way, then the question then comes, do you, go with a little bit less in terms of personnel on a regular basis going forward as a means of trying to maintain that fiscal stability? And that's certainly one way to go about it. If we were to, not hire as many positions, or we were to try and restrict as much as is possible, either wage increases on the personnel side, although you've got them in place for the next 3 or 4 years for the bargaining units, or try to constrain expenditures which have already been holding pretty close to flat outside of personnel. There are ways in which you could make that constraint come pretty close, I think, to being near equilibrium. I'm not going to say that it would get to equilibrium. I think you can constrain expenditures a little bit more, but then it becomes an issue of, if we are intending on providing the public services that we say in the budget, we're not going to be able to provide them at that level. And that's entirely a policy decision, and we work however we're going to do, how we make that work. The biggest issue for me on the expenditure side is that now about 77 or 78% of the budget is personnel costs. And by that I mean we're including the pensions every year, we're including the health insurance every year as part of the personnel costs. Our debt payments have gone up considerably in the last couple of years since the 2015 bond issues. And while we're going to have a refunding bond coming forward to try and lock in some long-term lower fixed rates on some of our debt, along with doing a short-term loan for equipment that had been planned for this year, I have already advised the other departments in the city not to plan on having any long-term debt for capital improvements for at least the next 2 years. That they need to try to come up with as much of those costs out of their operating budget as possible, which is going to put a great bigger strain on the operating dollars than has been the case in recent years. So there are things in tightening the belt that, without making adjustments to revenue, that we can probably make much of that deficit up, but it is going to result in strains on our ability to provide services at the level that they're at.
And how much do you expect to get with the new Nistas projects? How much are we expecting to get, with the assessment of the Nista project?
It's a very good question. The property value inside the neighborhood improvement zone since the zone took effect in 2012 has probably gone up in the neighborhood of $300 million, $300 to $400 million. Remember, however, that about $150 million of that is the PPL Center. And because that is within the title of the Neighborhood Improvement Zone Development Authority, the arena is tax exempt. We don't collect any property tax on that whatsoever.
Not only the arena, not the hotel, not the hospital.
But it's still a $150 million base, and that's a big chunk of where that additional property value is coming. But yes, the hotel, one city center, two city center, the strata complexes, now Tower 6, they're coming online, and I think we're reaching a point where you're going to start seeing some noticeable increases in property tax as a result of these buildings filling up and coming online. A building like 2 City Center, for example, has a assessed value somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 to $45 million. That is going to bring in an annual basis for us about $180,000 in tax revenue that we would not have otherwise had. And so any building down there that would be like 3 City Center, when it is full, which I think it is now, is probably about a $25 million property, and that comes up to about $100,000 in property tax. So it's coming in little bits and pieces. But it's the impact of that, I think, is not going to be really noticeable until we get the development continuing down in the waterfront area, and that we get the buildings that are currently being constructed at full capacity, because until they're at full capacity, I don't think the county is going to assess them at anything other than an interim value that is not full property value.
So 5 and 6, well, 5 is the one over the corner theater used to be, right?
5 is the one at the corner that's being built right now, at the corner of 8th and,
Oh, 8th and one.
at 8th and Hamilton.
Okay.
Tower 6 being the newest one, constructed at 6th Street, that just opened.
Which one is the one that was the corner theater, one of them was the one? 3, so that now we're getting full.
3, now we would be getting full on that one, because that is now full completely. 4 City Center, where Strata West is full. And Strata East and Strata Symphony, since I lived at Strata West, they've been being able to fill up those complexes, so we would be getting full valuation on those. 520 Hamilton will be up and running within another 6 months, and I'm sure they're gonna fill up that apartment pretty quickly. So the residential facilities and the first 4 or so of the office buildings are generally at full capacity, and now it's a matter of having to fill in, make sure Tower 6 gets filled up, and then when 5 City Center is ready, I know ADP is, as I understand it, planning on moving in there with a sizable number of employees. It's gonna take a little while for these properties to come online, but they will. And we will see, in the case of a building like that, probably another 100,000 to 200,000 a year in property taxes that come in the door, in that range, as soon as it's up to full operation.
Yeah, I have other questions, but I'm gonna ask my colleagues to gentlemen if they want to, if they have anything they want to ask.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Herzl, going back to, you mentioned now the casino fee. We get that on a quarterly basis?
What happens during the year is there's a little bit of a delay. The fourth quarter payment arrives on the first day of February of the following year. And so the fourth quarter payment, which was the first one for cash purposes that we received this year, not only did we get a distribution from the regular gaming outcomes, but we also got part of the fees that the Sands Casino has for just being allowed to operate. We get what amounts to about a double payment at that time of the year. That came in above $1.5 million, and the last 2 quarterly payments for the first and second quarter, we just got it at the start of August, so you're not going to see it in the monthly financials for July. Came in right around $950,000. So we're in the ballpark with 1 payment to go, being at about $3.4 million so far this year of the casino fee, against a budgeted amount of $3.9 million. If that number holds, for the third quarter payment, which we'll see at the beginning of November, we would come in the 4.2, 4.3 range against a budgeted amount of 3.9. Nice surplus.
Right, okay.
And right now, the pace looks like it's headed there. Anything can happen, I suppose, for the final quarter, but we're definitely coming in above estimates at this point.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question for now.
Thank you. Let's move to.
Just a quick question. When we get that casino payment, from which account do we deposit that payment once we get it?
There is, thank you, Councilwoman Mota, in the revenue accounts, if you have your July report in front of you right now, there is a particular line item on the second page under intergovernmental revenue that you see the item number 6195, which shows casino fee. And so far, at the same time a year ago through the end of July, we had collected $2,179,000. Through July, we had collected $2,519,000 for this year, and with the payment that's coming, that we just got in August, that number is going to be very close to $3.5 million. So it's coming in at a much more robust pace than it did a year ago, and it's coming in, as far as we can tell, on basically low estimates right now, but it's that row, 6195 on the second page.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Based on what you're telling us, then, that there should be really no need for a tax increase?
Thank you for raising that issue, which is a very important one, Councilman Zugal. What I would say is that if we are going to live with the constraints on not having as fully budgeted the number of people that we want to have doing certain things in the city, if we keep our personnel costs constrained well below what we're doing in terms of what's budgeted for them, I think we can probably make up a lot of that whole by means of keeping our personnel costs constrained, but that would be the only way in which it would be possible to avoid that.
Even though we have all this additional, real estate tax money coming in from center cities buildings?
Well, with a couple extra buildings, we could be getting another 200,000 to 300,000. We could be annually. With the casino fee coming in where it's at, it's another 400,000. But to get to the level of what we had proposed in the budget for the level of services that have been sought to be provided by it, that gets you maybe a fifth of the way there to closing that hole. And we're certainly glad that the revenues are coming in better than they are, but the only reason that we're going to be able, as we did in 2017, to keep those costs constrained so that we don't run a significant deficit is, again, going to be primarily to not hiring as many people to do the jobs that we have budgeted for. And the revenue increases, while we're certainly pushing them there, and we're trying to collect more business privilege tax very aggressively, a $4 million hole takes a whole lot of things to go right to be able to close it completely.
I didn't say close it completely. I just said you could use a tax increase.
I understand where you're coming from.
You answered it. Now we got a yes or a no.
Yes. Yes.
That's one of those truths.
I'm done.
Thank you. Mr. Evans?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think I took a completely different tack from the presentation, Mr. Hartzell, in that from a sound structural standpoint, you know, we do need to potentially look at doing a tax increase because using the Ouija board to determine whether or not we're gonna get lucky on everything has not worked for 12 years. And it seems to have put us in the position we're in. So that was what I took away from it. But I just have a couple of quick questions for you. One thing on the casino fee, just because I was brought up by several other members and I just want to understand completely. When we received the money in the February payment, which includes the fourth quarter, do we account that as cash for the current budget year, or do we have anything that goes back to the previous budget year since it was for that fourth quarter?
We account for it as all cash for the current year.
Okay, that's what I
And
thought.
that's how we've done it as a standard going back several
Right,
years.
and that's what I thought. I just wanted to verify that.
It's like a counter too.
Exactly, yep, I just wanted to make sure that that was correct, since that includes that. The 7 million plus that you said we have sitting in the reserve account, that's as of when?
Probably right now.
Okay, and out of that
That's a
7,
reasonable estimate of that's where we are at this moment.
okay, and that 7 million is going to be including the, I think it's 5.2 million, that would be Locksbox money, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so we're looking at roughly about 2 million, maybe a little under $2 million, depending upon what's in there.
That would be outside of the stabilization fund, yes.
So that would be available that we can use in the case of an emergency without having to repay it by December 31st.
That is correct.
Okay. In terms of the structural deficit that we're looking at, since 78% is personnel cost related, and if this isn't something you have an answer for, if you could get me an answer, I would appreciate it. What are we looking at in terms of a rough increase in our personnel costs outside of wages over the last, say, 2 to 3 years?
Standard increase for health insurance costs is about 7% on an annual basis. So in the general fund, that is a hit of about $1 million, maybe a tidbit over $1 million.
Okay.
1.1 to the general fund, and then you've got that same increase across some of the other separate funds as well where we have employees. The pension cost, the MMO cost, minimum municipal obligation, made a sizable leap in 2017 because of the new calculations that we made going with a longer mortality table and assuming what we think a more reasonable rate of return on the pension investments. The pension board had its quarterly meeting today, and it's looking as if the 2019 budget will have a very minimal change from what's in 2018. The current projection that came from Chiron today, where I think we had 10.8 million out of the general fund for MMO this year, had it right at 11 million. So the pension cost itself will hold relatively flat.
Okay.
The big change for 2019 would be on health insurance.
Okay, and so if we look at a scenario in which with the NIS revenue, potentially increases in the casino revenue and everything else, and in the discussion of how that could if we don't fill positions, maybe we could eke it through without having the structural deficit take an effect. When we're looking at an increase in health costs, does that include that, if we would have a 7% increase in health costs next year?
When we did the five-year plan, I factored that in as a 7%
And
annual.
I figured you
increase.
did, I just wanted to double check on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't have messed around with that one, because that's too big an item not to
Right.
take into account.
How much of what we're looking at in terms of the increased business privilege tax, potential increase in the value of the buildings downtown, casino revenue, let's just say for a minute that we would see a significant economic downturn at any point next year or the following year.
Mhm.
If you feel comfortable, can you give us an idea as to how much of an impact something like that could have on the best case scenario of maybe we can get through without having to do anything?
I think in terms of, let's measure this against what I had factored in terms of the five-year plan. I had made assumptions there of a 1.5% annual increase in property tax. And a 2.5% annual increase, which I think is where you're going with this, because we talked about it before in terms of resident or income tax, and a 3% annual increase in business privilege tax. Because of the way in which property tax is calculated in the city, I don't think the immediate hit on property tax would be bad. I don't think we'd see much of an increase, but I don't think it would be a significant one. The bigger risk, I think, would be on the earned income tax side, because we have definitely factored that in as, and that things have been moving very well the last year or so in that category, actually longer than that. The bigger delta in a bad way would come from that category.
Okay, and in terms of our overall health picture, and if this is something you don't feel comfortable answering, if our financial advisor could perhaps answer it, let's just say for a second that we bank on best case scenario, and we don't look at trying to close the structural deficit with any type of a tax increase. What type of effect could that have on our bond rating moving forward in terms of a lack of trying to fix the problem, basically?
You're gonna get downgraded.
And that would be something you would probably expect to see next year, correct?
You'll see that this time next year.
Okay, so it's basically stating that if we don't try to make a real solution to the problem, if we just cross our fingers and hope that the best case scenario happens, we're gonna get downgraded no matter what, because the primary reason they downgraded us this time was because of the fact that we were seeing a potential structural problem and there was no solution to it.
They did not downgrade you this.
I'm sorry,
They-
what would be the
they-
correct way to
they-
say that?
They gave you a negative outlook,
Okay,
which was saying you haven't addressed the structural imbalance. Everything's, there's some things, as we talked about, that are going great, but they're not enough to address the structural imbalance, long-term. And they're, since the financial crisis, the rating agencies are on top of this stuff, like years ago. You know, they downgraded, City of Lancaster, earlier this summer, to A3. They hold City of Reading in a BAA, rating, which is a very marginal rating. Each of those cities, you know, there's similar size, and they have different challenges than Allentown. Allentown, I think, if going to bed in the city would be this one, rather than those two.
right.
Although the Lancaster folks probably be after me with darts. But, you know, it is important for fiscal health to have cash. Cash is absolutely king whenever you're looking at this. And the way that the rating agencies look at municipal credits is they measure the absolute level of cash against your budget, and they measure what the trend is on that cash. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying the same? And yours is going like this.
So then also I would, from what you're saying, I would take away that it's not just in our best interest to plug the hole, but it's in our best interest to also try and look at returning our cash reserves and growing those as well, correct?
Yes, but I think that's part of the larger, longer conversation.
Of course.
That says, okay, what's the right level of, what did I call it? What we were talking earlier, not a rainy day fund, but what's the right level of available cash to have on hand for a city of this size? And I can help you with that.
Sure.
I can show you where other cities are. But ultimately, that's a decision, that's a community decision embodied at your table. So, I mean, it's a good idea, if you can do it, to keep that cash. And there are methods and strategies that we can talk about. Maybe you put the growth in the bank over time. And that's something that I can take to the rating agency to say, okay, they have a fund balance policy. They've decided to try to keep the level here, and they're gonna take any pleasant surprises and grow that surplus and that cash, so that when the economy changes, you'll have enough leeway to be able to address it without having to do drastic measures. And that's really what we're talking about. We were getting at, the economy's roaring right now. It's not gonna do that forever.
Right.
And when it turns, everybody remembers how 2008 was. Everybody starts heading for the hills. And you don't wanna be in a position of having to borrow at that moment with an impaired credit rating. It'll be very expensive if you can get it.
Thank you. My only remaining question, Mr. Hartzell, is your best guess. So we have roughly about $2 million in our reserve fund right now. Barring any other issues where we have to spend more money on legal fees or computer issues or any other unknown scenario, let's just say for a minute that $2 million stays there. What do you see as an ending surplus for the year that we would be going into 2019 with?
If we stayed at the current level that I'm guessing that we're at, I would consider that to be a realistic best case scenario.
So to stay with the 2 million, not really
Yes.
any addition to it?
No.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I'm a little bit pessimistic, more pessimistic than you are, that we're gonna stay on that, especially with, litigations that we have ongoing. That's only, we have a lot of other expenses that we're gonna have, I'm sure. I think the only thing that can save us a little bit will be getting a good chunk of money from the casino fee. You talked about, which Mr. Robinson was talking, I went back and looked at my notes, and you said that we have about $13 million in the general funds right now, a little bit over $13 million. Now, that $13 million is, we are getting more money as more revenue as the year continues. How much money do we spend per month, let's say? What's the
Well, right about now, it is in the neighborhood of $8 million, about $8 million a month in the general fund. As our spending comes up pretty close to $100 million during the course of the year.
So that means we need about 18 million, at least 18 million to get it AAA rating that we want to.
Well, I think what Tom had been saying, and I think would be looked upon very favorably by the rating agencies, whether it comes from a long-term recurring cut in expenditures or a long-term recurring increase in revenues or a combination thereof. If we make a demonstrated effort to plug that hole, given the level of service that is deemed important out of the budget process, I think that the rating agencies are going to look upon our situation more favorably. The $13 million that we have in cash into 2018, keep in mind that a portion of that was also being reserved for paying off pension obligation bonds at a faster rate. And the decision was made for the 2018 budget to instead use that to pay for the increase in the minimum municipal obligation on the recurring pension expenditures. So I had never considered that part of the $13 million ever to be available to us for general purposes. And so that's why I usually go with a figure that's closer to 7 as a means of what practically we can rely upon as a dollar amount.
Well, when you say 7, you're including stabilization funds.
I am including the stabilization
So we're
funds.
talking about, like Mr. Robinson indicated earlier, you're talking about $2 million.
Outside of the stabilization fund, that would be correct, yes.
$2 million is not a lot for only a $5 million budget.
Well, we're certainly, like I said, we're trying to constrain expenditures as well as we can, and I like the path that we're on at this point, and revenue collection's coming in very well, so everything that's, as far as things are happening so far this year, the trends are good, but we do have our expenditures in the risk management fund and health insurance are running a little bit above where I'd be comfortable with, and you never know what kind of things may happen during the course of the rest of the year. So I think our overall situation right now is solid, optimistic, but we'll see what happens over the next 3 months. Get ready for bringing the budget to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hudson. Any further comments from the dais before I go to the public? Mr. Glazer.
Please, let me throw some gas on this fire.
Don't go too much, but go ahead.
You know, I can give you a little bit of good news. I think, I have, been vocal about what I consider to be, overly rosy estimates in terms of, EMS revenue over the past 2 years. But I think this year they may do it, or they're gonna come close to it, and that could be a plus of anywhere between, I don't know, $700,000 to $1 million that we didn't have before. That's what they're tracking now.
That's good.
You know, I'm not sure, Brent and I had a discussion about this earlier, I'm not sure what the receivables are that haven't made it into the bank yet. But they're tracking in a very positive direction, so that's a good thing, that's a very important piece. You know, we're certainly, always, good to be concerned about risk. I noticed that professional losses, we really haven't paid out a whole lot yet this year, and there's, $700,000, you know, there. If you guys aren't getting a list of, cases from the solicitor every month, so you have an idea what the exposure is, you need to get that. Because that would, help all of us look at this in a more informed manner. So the fact that we haven't paid out professional losses is a good thing, and I hope I'm not jinxing anything. You know, Mr. Hartzell discussed the vacancy factor. You know, we're down to a number of police. You know, we all know, you guys better than most, that you can't snap your fingers to fill those positions. It takes time. They've got to be credited. They've got to go through classes. My expectation would be that those positions will be filled. I mean, we were up to almost a full complement not that long ago. I know it didn't last very long until we had retirements. But I would expect the administration and this council to support having a full complement of police on the street. If you've been on council long enough, you remember a lot of lean years, you know, in the early teens where the city couldn't address some of the capital needs. And the water and sewer release went through and we had some cash and we addressed those needs, or began to address those needs. And the same is true for some personnel issues, you know. You can only balance so much on the back of the vacancy factor before you have problems. And I think the current administration is making somewhat of an effort to put more inspectors on the streets and do some of those things. So I guess my point here is, it's a balancing act. And that if it's your priority to put more feet on the street doing services, then you have to be willing to pay for it one way or another. As Mr. Hartzell said, most of our costs are personnel related. You know, the report that I gave a couple weeks ago regarding actual spending versus budgeted spending, and I think Cynthia, you asked the question, what's that total amount? How much money are in those categories? You know, off the top of my head, it's $10 to $12 million out of a $105 million budget. So those are non-personnel related expenses. You know, once again, you can only cut that stuff so far before you can't fix a toilet at Cedar Beach, or you can't do some things because you don't have the funds for it. You know, some of the funds are coming in at a pretty brisk manner. I think Brent and myself will have a better idea about what the end of the year looks like, probably at the end of September, when most of those funds will have been due anyway, and one can predict with greater reliability and clarity where we should end up. But I agree that so far this year, we're at a good clip for revenues. Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Sure, Mr. Commissioner. There's obviously no pun intended when you mentioned the toilet overflowing of City Beach.
I could have used Kent Park as well, but,
Okay.
I don't mean to laugh about it, but we spend a fair amount of money on plumbing supplies, because you've got infrastructure that needs to be maintained, whether it's the city hall or the city parks.
Yeah,
Thank you, sir.
sure. Open it up to the public. Mr. Hirschman,
Yes, sir, thank you.
I'm sure you have one or two
The
questions.
podium
Well, I
appears to be in
think if we
reverse
begin with-
order, by the way,
with
from
my
what it usually is.
Yeah.
I'll give my address. 4 or 5 North Silver Street. I think where the problem starts with the city council.
I want to quantify it.
That's the hole in the floor.
I'm one of the place ones here.
Thank you, Mr.
I think where
Robinson.
the problem starts is begin with the city council. These tax budgets, the deficits. You approved the budget has this coming year with $104 million of revenue, but then you approve expenditure of $108 million. You're putting yourself for $84 million in a hole. I mean, you just gotta start looking at these things, and how you're passing budget. I mean, this hand here, that's how much revenue, but here you're spending more. I mean, this is not the way we operate when I was on city council. We never passed a budget where expenditures exceeded revenue. We never did that. That was one of our goals. Never.
Well, that's what I'm looking for.
Huh?
I'm looking for that for this project.
I mean, you've been doing this for the last couple of years. And this should continue. And then what I'm looking at is, are we sacrificing public safety to keep the expenses low? We just said that about policemen. We knew we were gonna be these policemen short. I don't know how often we have the police academy, whether we can have more people at the police academy. So when we get this, I mean, I hate to see a city our size balance a budget on the backs of public safety. We need public safety in this community. And I think council got to get on administration to find out why we're balancing the budget on public safety's back. I mean, this is not the way to operate. And then another thing, I'm concerned, are we gonna be going over the finance report later on?
Yeah.
Later on,
Mhm.
not now.
Yes, not now.
Okay, so that's my concern. And then this gentleman here, Northwest Financial.
Just that.
I
Mr. Beckman have to.
Wait, I have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
When we hired Northwest Financial, I thought it was to go over our debt, how we can work on our debt and reduce our debt and maybe refinance our debt. But now I hear he's coming out with a new financial report. Then we hire him just to review how we can refinance our debt. And now we're going into other areas.
I think we hired him so he can look into it.
Long-term financial planning was also included in the
Yeah, well, I don't
RFP.
think so. You look at the contract that came in front of city, it was for the review our debt. And how do we,
I think that's part of
it
it.
was never to come up with suggestions how we should balance the budget and the debt we have and everything. I mean, raise revenue and everything else. I think what we're doing, we're exceeding what we hired this gentleman for. And I think council got to look into that also. So we need administration, just do it like they want to do, like every ordinance on the,
Where are we on this schedule?
Anyone have any issue?
Well, I have.
If you wanna wait until we do the rest of it.
While we're talking about budget, I just have some comments or questions or whatever. What percentage of the personal cost is overtime out of that 79% number? What are we talking about? Where are we up to on overtime overall?
A year ago, in account of 06, we came in spending at just over $4 million. Out of a total personnel budget of a little over 76 million. So far, this year, let's see, we, at the end of July a year ago, we were at 1,948,000. We're at 1,866,000 so far this year. So the numbers are holding pretty steady in terms of overtime. And the one area in which I know there's been a little bit of an overtime bump has been in EMS, because they're having to fill in full complement of positions, and their overall wage under permanent wages has actually balanced out against the increased overtime, so that their wage is actually holding steady. Everything else is actually pretty well constrained.
So what's the total number so far, you said?
$1,866,000 for the first 7 months of the year.
7 months.
Yes.
I'm a little confused. Last year said it was 1.2.
$1,948,000 for the first 7 months. And I'm looking at row 06 on page 3.
He's comparing months.
Okay.
Does the overtime go up?
The $1,200,000 was the vacancy factor that I mentioned earlier. What I'm showing right now, I'm looking at line 06, premium pay, on page 3 of the monthly report. At this point, a year ago, under what shows the MTD column for 2017, we had spent $1,948,000 on premium pay. Go over 3 columns to the left for year to date through July. This year it's $1,866,000, so we're down a little bit.
So when does it cost, when does this number exceed when you should start hiring people in some of these positions?
Well, the example that I think was raised with EMS is a perfect one right now, is that they're trying to fill those positions as quickly as possible, and there's been an increase in call volume, so we had to have people out there on a regular basis to be able to take EMS calls, but the wages have been stifled in terms of permanent wages, so that the overall cost in wage has not really changed that much for that area, and that will, as they hire more people, the overtime impact will drop and the permanent wages will be more in line with what they would be expected to be.
Okay, EIT, we all know that went from, I think 2012, it went from like 8-point-something million up to 28 million, I read. It's a big number, $20 million. How long do you expect this to continue in that slope?
This is exactly where Councilman Robinson was going with this. And I think it's a very important question, Mr. Hunsaker, that we have been seeing, in addition to the rate growth, we have been seeing collection growth in the neighborhood of 2 to 3% the last couple of years, as an impact separate from the rate growth itself, or from the rate increases themselves. We have factored into the 5-year plan a 2.5% annual increase at the current rate of the 1.975% resident EIT holding steady, and then factoring growth, given growth in income of about 2.5% on an annual basis. That is, I think, a realistically optimistic way of seeing things at this point, but there is some significant downside that could happen if we indeed hit a recession.
So you're telling me, if I understand this, the 28 million, you expect a 2.5% increase for 2019?
That from the 28.5 that we're at right now, yes, sir.
And then 19, what's your projection?
Will be 2.5% above the 28.5. So it would be like.
How far out do you think that this is gonna go?
Well, that is in the 5-year plan, that's what we have factored in, every year for that period. I think for that, from what we had been seeing in income growth over the previous, not just this year, but the previous couple of years before that, it's on the optimistic side, but I thought it was also a realistic estimate that we could, through the 5-year period, expect that type of increase.
So your projections is gonna be based on people moving into these units, high rises, versus the actual workers and construction workers?
I expect that wherever we're generating the income from, wherever the source of it is, that's the pace that we're seeing over the last couple of years.
Okay, we'll make be up later.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fonseca. All right, let's move on to,
It's got Mr. Holmes.
they're leaving, so. I don't know if it's because you're coming over to speak.
Okay, I think it's above my pay grade to fix this because it's not going on. We couldn't hear, the other two, people talking. Is it working now?
It's working. I can hear you, please.
You have a green light there?
No. I didn't turn it, that's above my pay grade. Is it unplugged?
Could we take one of the microphones from the administration table?
There seems to be plugs out here, Mike.
That was Courtney's fault, the way you turned it around. Of course.
You're right, I tried to tell him. Better?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, we hear you now.
You got 1 more minute.
The best part is, for that minute, I will repeat that in a few more days, I will get the bank accounts, and I'm asking that the forensic audit information that we get be made available in time for the budget complaint. Now, if you want me to repeat it for 30 more seconds, I can, or did you get it that time?
We got it.
All right. Now, my proposal that no one wants to look at or no one can discuss is the 10% reduction in the budget from all departments. And each department must defend why they can't give 10%, they can only give 9% or 8 or 7 or 6, whatever the council wants to allow them to have. Now, the other question is, if the vacancy isn't part of the manipulation of the money in the budget. In other words, if you don't fill the job within, let's say, 35 days or whatever you want, that money can't get spent or transferred into anything else. So that eliminates the healthcare cost and the salary that gets spent in the budget that wasn't supposed to, because it was supposed to be for hiring a person. So that's revenue income that's planned in. Now, the other thing that no one wants to take in consideration is something our president brought up, is that in the past, there were times when it got near the end of the budget, he would say, hey, here's a report. You spent this much money and you only have this much left for your account, and that's not being done, to let them that going over. Nobody does any scrutiny on the solicitor fund. We now know that there's thousands of dollars being spent, but it doesn't matter. Well, how much over budget were they? So right now, if we do simple math, the next budget is estimated to be 112 million. That's 12 million a month for the 12 months. And if you, what I'm saying is that deducting the 10% from the 112 would give us 12 million if we don't get it. But if we get 10, that's less money that you have to collect from the taxpayers, or as my friend Courtney says, he wants to charge the taxpayers more so we have extra money. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me at a time like this where the taxpayer. Now, the other thing is, in the bank accounts, all the money that's in the projects and it's not used has to go in a bank account so it can't be manipulated. Right now, there's not enough got in the sausage fund, and it got all mixed up, and now we can't get it back for the project it was for. So then another bond or another, it comes back again, and we're paying double. The escrow money that was talked about drove me crazy. What's the escrow fund and the NISO connection? That has to be figured out, because we're still trying to find out where the Allison money was, the 1.7 that was given to him, that was lost. And
I think you're gonna figure that out when you give them the,
well, I need help from the forensic guy, because I'm not getting that. I'm getting the bank account. I'm just trying to explain how close we are to saving the money. $8 million a year expenditure. Even if you raise it up to $10 million a month, it's time to look at it. And I think council should take the position that I'm offering and say, look, you departments have to do this. Now, there's cars and things that can be looked at, so
Mr. Hunt.
I'm asking for,
With all due respect though, are you willing to take 10% from the police department, which would be about 22 officers? We should delete those.
I'm not getting rid of the fleet, I'm not getting rid of.
Well, I don't know how
I'm
you're gonna
looking
come
for
up with
efficiency.
10% savings.
I'm looking for what they call do more with less.
And I
You're taking
understand
it
that,
personal.
But your 10% is an
No, you're
unrealistic
taking
number.
it personal that I'm trying to get rid of people. I'm not.
Well-
I'm just trying to say, maybe if we had the Conterra, contract, and people took better care of the cars, and they were repaired, and we didn't have to go into, another project, and then we, had better use of the used cars and pass them down. If the police needs it.
because you really got more.
You understand, I'm not cutting,
People at
you
times-
took that
Well,
personally.
not understanding, but
Yeah,
that's okay.
but you got triple the time, so let's give an opportunity to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Han, and, we still got two more, bills that we wanna discuss. And, we also have the financial report. So, let's talk about Bill 48.
Bill 48 amends the general fund budget to accommodate position changes in the Department of Finance, Bureau of Accounting and Financial Management, eliminating the position of Deputy Finance Director and Treasury, and reinstating the Treasury and Accounting Manager position.
Okay, Mr. Herzl.
This had been a position that, going back to a few years before my arrival as finance director, had been, this was Ms. Bowen's position, in which assignments besides treasury and accounting were added to it in a deputy director capacity. And there was immense workload that she had to deal with. And I tried to remove as much of that as I could in the last couple of years that was not tied to treasury and accounting. Now that she is no longer with the city and we are about to promote from within to refill that position, I want to change what has been an 18N position in that role to a 17N, so that the person who will be responsible for it is entirely focused upon treasury and accounting.
So it would be from 18N to 17N?
Yes.
Okay, so we're saving a little bit money there.
And compared to what I think the incoming wage will be, we're going to be saving, yes, a few $1,000s.
So that goes into the sausage fund. Just kidding.
Thanks for that.
I just wanna make the technicality laugh over there. All right, any comments from the dais on this?
I just like that he says that they're promoting from within, and that's what we like. That's what I like to see happen.
Any comments, anybody, or Mr. Robinson?
Mr. Chairman, I just have one question. Mr. Ross, could you just give a breakdown as to what the duties were and how they're changing, what duties you're taking away, and how those duties that you're taking away are going to be dealt with?
I really wish I had brought my notes with me on that one, because I have it.
If you don't have that information,
I will get it to
okay.
you, because Debbie, before she left, actually listed, here's the things I did as deputy director that were separate from treasury and accounting. And they were in many things involving executive level responsibilities that had been assigned to her over the years. I will get you that list so you can see what that is. And I am in the process, in terms of next year's budget, coming up with a solution for that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Hartzell. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just saying that, Mr. Hartsel, that I was thinking of the same thing, but, so, are you taking over some of the duties that deputy, the deputy finance director was doing? Is that what you?
At least for the short term, yes.
Okay,
I'm not saying necessarily for when we get to 2019, but for the short term, yes.
okay. So we don't have a void in the process.
No, it's a good time to have this consideration happen, considering that we're done with the audit for the year and that we're now getting into the budget process. If there was any time in which we could kind of reconfigure things, this is the time of year to do it.
Okay, all right.
That's my question as a follow-up to that would be that we may have to revisit this down the road then?
I'm already planning on that in terms of what I plan on presenting in terms of the budget for 2019 for finance.
Okay. All right, thank you.
For Brooke, any comments from the, Mr. Hunsaker?
Yeah, hold on, Mr. I'm taking off from where Courtney and you were saying, I wanted to know, could we get a job description of the past of Debbie's and the new one, so we can compare what's going on?
Absolutely, that can be easily put to, at the next
Some
time.
kind of
that we
great
meet.
format in the next month or so, we can look at this and just see where we are. Now, my other question is, you need some help in your department. I'm sorry to say, because reconciliation isn't happening in a timely manner. That's just one item. So we have to do something. What are you gonna propose in the new budget to correct this situation?
That's not a question for now.
Well, it's
That's
along the same
related
lines,
to this.
well, it's along lines, he needs help. Maybe there should be a,
We're getting a little bit off the focus.
well, when is that gonna come up? I mean, if this is in the same area, I mean, I'm not talking about Cedar Beach Pool, I'm talking about,
We are getting very close to being running the Maybank reconciliations, which, considering that we're in the middle of August, it's still not good enough, but we're making some major headway on that end. With the new assignment of responsibilities, with the hiring from within in that office, we are making it a primary consideration to get to, we hope, 45 days out, in terms of the timing of the reconciliation. So we're making progress.
well, that's a good sign, making progress. And we have a date or a commitment from you that by the end of this year, you will be within 45 days. Yes or no?
I will give it my best shot.
So that means, how many people must we hire? Do we have to have one person? There's
Well,
one.
let's direct the question to me, I don't wanna.
Okay.
So-
I mean,
No, I mean, you can ask.
when can we have a
Let me-
discussion about this?
See, the issue I think is.
I'm trying to get some people on board that we can do this. So we don't have to come up here and ask this.
No, he just said earlier that he is gonna come back to us, to ask us.
We've been doing this for 3 years.
Well, Mr.
Now,
Mr.
somewhere
Hendricks,
after 3 years, we gotta solve this problem.
I agree, I agree.
Then, so, they,
I agree.
he knows he has to do it, so what?
He said that he's gonna come back to us,
Okay,
right?
let's move on.
He answered that question to you. Thank you, Mr. Hunsaker. Anybody else? If not, could the vote, actually.
I'll make a motion at this time that this be moved favorably before the full council with a favorable
I
recommendation.
second.
All in favor, please, by saying aye. Aye. Motion carried. Thank you. Bill 51, please.
Bill 51 amends the 2017 general fund cash balance and the 2017 capital fund cash balance to provide for the transfer of cash as directed by the city's auditing firm, Zelenkovsky Axelrod LLC, to correct the negative cash balance in the capital fund.
Okay. Mr. Harris.
As Mr. Hirschman had rightly pointed out after we did the CAFR presentation a month ago, this is something that's in the interfund transfer, and even though it was done as part of the end-of-year accounting process for 2017, he's absolutely right, and I agree totally, that we needed to bring this in front of you as a formal ordinance request to make that transfer approved in the appropriate fashion.
Okay, thank you. And coming from the, dais. If not,
Yes.
something, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hartzell, is it possible, because in reading through the bill description here, it talks about the process you did for reconciliation and the breakdown, the rough breakdown from how it came from capital fund, the 11 and 15 general offering bonds, and the escrow funds, and then the $3.5 million that we transferred. Can we get a detailed breakdown of this, especially looking towards how it was broken down from the remaining projects, what projects, what remaining money was from, but also more importantly, what the projects were from 2002 and 2003 that led to this situation in the first place, sort of how we got here and how we can hopefully never get here again.
There are probably a couple of smiling faces behind me that have been finishing the work on where the project money reallocations are done to get us to the point that we're at currently. I have a list from 2002 of projects that were issued that particular year that probably are connected to not having had any revenue come in the door with them. And I do have that list, and I can provide that as well in the very near future.
As a follow-up then, is there any type from what you went through, from what the auditors went through? Do you have any recommendations, whether they need to be done as administrative changes or legislative changes, as to how we can prevent this from happening in the future? Specifically related to, we're talking about 16 years ago, well before you and the majority of your senior staff was working here. So, as you said, you went back and looked at it and you're sort of guessing which ones were the ones that were funded and not funded. Do you have any recommendations for how we can, A, better track it, and B, make sure that something like this doesn't happen again?
Councilman Robinson, I could not agree with you more, and I particularly, Mr. Hunsaker is coming up near to the podium again. What we've been trying to do the last couple of years in the capital reports, when we bring them up quarterly, is show the connection between the project and the specific bond issue that's funding it. And in those cases, we want to be absolutely transparent that not only do we have a full confidence that there's this much money left in that particular project, but that money that is within a specific bond issue, a specific commitment is being tied to that, so you can draw those connections without having to guess.
And is this going to be the changes you're recommending part of the general best practices that you said you are working on putting together for your whole department?
Yeah, we're not gonna go mess around with capital budgeting. We're
Well,
gonna-
no, I'm less worried about you than I am the person who will be sitting in that chair in 2035. So if it's a written down policy that you're putting together, then that's a much better one. So, but thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What makes you think he won't be there in 2035?
I'm certainly hoping by that point that he can get to enjoy his retirement.
Well, Mr. Hudson.
Mike, can we get the update on the bill, if possible?
This bill for-
I thought I read something that said 2017. I mean, are you correcting the deposit at the end of the year with this movement?
Yes, sir.
So that's why you couldn't give us the numbers before the end of the.
This was as part of the reconciliation process to complete the 2017 audit, and so therefore it happened during the 2017 fiscal year, and is therefore being changed in accordance with the CAFR.
So you can't show in the Madoff report that you're transferring the money last month or the month before, you have to show it from, you have to correct the report from December. Is that what you're
It's
saying?
actually in your favorite report, which I will not refer to by that name.
Okay.
When you look at the pooled cash on page 11, and you see that big bump in the capital fund from April to May, that's when the transfer happened. Or we went from negative 2.8 million in May to almost 500,000 in April to almost 500,000 to the plus side in May.
So this is a cash transfer,
That was.
but you're referring it back to December 31st of 17.
Because as part of the closeout for the year, the determination was finally made in the spring as to what the overall hit that had to go back to the capital fund was. And so the journal entry at that point to move the cash over was finally determined in May, but it was tied to wrapping up the audit for 2017.
So in the CAFR, their numbers reflect this transfer.
Yes, sir. I'll show you on page 94 where it is in the
I
paper.
wanted to ask you another question on another fund, but maybe I'm out of order, in that, how come we don't do this with the Trexler fund, money that's always negative?
I actually have something to say about that.
Well, we can pick that up later, right?
Yeah, because they actually asked for that. Thank you, Mr. Hudson. All right, need a say aye? Aye. All right, motion carries. Let's talk about the actual, financial report for July, which is something that we've been talking about for a while, but let's do it more formally now. Mr. Hunsicker, will you please, Mr. Hunsicker, follow the age guys here.
Get him a chair.
The 4H.
I have an email in which Mr. Hahn adopted me involuntarily into the brood, which I do take that very seriously, so however we choose to proceed.
Go right ahead, sir.
Yes, let's talk over, we've already kind of gone into this in the discussions that we were having about our overall budgetary condition heading up to the, through the first 7 months of the year. I've pretty well explained what's been going on in the general fund up to this point. If I go to page 2, you can see that whereas we had taken in 67% of revenue by this point of 2017, we're at 70% of budgeted revenue so far for 2018, and the amount that we have collected is, we've gone from about 66 million at this point a year ago to over 73 million this year. Now, some of that is going to come, there's going to be some escrow monies going back to the neighborhood improvement zone as part of our annual reconciliation process, which will bring that down a little bit. But nonetheless, we are collecting at a very robust rate compared with a year ago, and that it's not in any way diminishing, that our overall collections are coming in very well. The expenditures on page 3, as I mentioned.
Just let me stand for a second, Mr. Hudson. Where is the money, where is it that we see the income from the, forgot the line of item, from the money that is left over from the, from the needs that comes back?
Oh, the leftovers at the end of the year.
Yes.
Let's see, what line would we put that one in? We had budgeted for it this year at about 200,000, and we ended up getting a little bit more than that, and I'm trying to remember. I'll verify that for you, because that one may be sitting in the miscellaneous numbers, but I'm gonna verify that and get back to you on
Yeah,
it.
please.
Because we did get that cash.
All right, great, thank you, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
No, that's perfect, that's a good question. I will get back with you on that one, as soon as possible on that. Let's see what we got here. Page 3 on the expenditure side, we have, like I said, with the stormwater fee in existence now and some of the positions that used to be in the general fund tied to stormwater, that is partly to explain why our costs compared with 7 months of the previous year are almost flat, 55,296,000 against 55,191,000. When we talked about the reasons as to why our costs have been constrained to a great degree. Nothing more really to say on that issue. If you have any questions, I'll wait.
Pretty much even.
Okay. Page 4 of the Drexler Fund. I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about this at this point, but we have been in some discussions with them about how the Drexler funds, with the Drexler Trust, about how these funds are to be used in the future. And we have put in a couple of rather sizable reimbursement requests in the last couple of months to the Drexler Trust. And I'm expecting that once we get this resolution dealt with with the trust of how the funds are going to be spent going forward, that we will see a rather sizable check coming to us very shortly to make up the deficit that's showing in the Drexler Fund right now. That's the big issue on that one.
Risk fund.
On the risk fund, the big issue, of course, that I'm looking at carefully is item 37 in the expenditures, account 37, dealing with the actual healthcare costs. They are coming, we had a much comparatively healthier July, no pun intended, but that cost string is still something that I am watching out for, and given the awareness of the other issues in which we're needing to tap the reserve and the risk budget at this point, I am watching that one quite warily to be sure that we're not going to run into any problems with the other things that we're trying to do with it. Nothing really special on this one in terms of, actually expenditures are coming in a bit less than they were a year ago on this. Revenues are coming in quite robustly. You will see in the August statement, the second transfer of the 7-year loan from the solid waste fund to the general fund. I authorized that transfer about a week ago. And so the August statement will show that $643,000 coming over from the general fund back to the solid waste fund to repay that loan in accordance with the ordinance.
About the stormwater.
Nothing surprising in terms of that at this point, in terms of revenue collected or expenditures going out the door, pretty much what we were expecting to see at this point of the year.
And, God fund.
It was another good month in July in terms of revenues exceeding expenditures by about $72,000. We'll see with all the rain that we've had in August if this will end up sustaining itself this month, but it's interesting to note after having gotten off to a slow start for the year that we've actually now just barely passed 2017 for revenues at the end of July, $738,000 versus $734,000. So we finally caught up in terms of actual fees for the year for use of the course at the end of July.
It's amazing, there's not so much rain.
Mm-hmm.
We still will be, about 3 or 4
The
months.
deficit is still above $250,000 in the fund, as we will get to when we get to the pool cash page, or the non-pool cash page.
Okay, 9/11.
No surprises on this. Everything pretty much coming in as we would have expected there too.
Good. And, anything on the personnel?
This is probably the good example that I was raising when the questions had come up earlier dealing with overtime pay. If you look at premium pay here, you will see that police are at 48% of budget, whereas fire is at 66% of budget for the year. And the driver for that in fire is EMS. That has been the primary reason why that percentage has been spending a bit higher than what we had taken in. And for the reasons I had mentioned, there's actually been a downward impact in EMS with respect to permanent wages that counterbalances that increase in overtime for that area.
Let's do it right. All right, anything under these,
Before you go,
that's for
Mr. Chairman, line 09, premium pay.
Yes, thank you, President McLean. That one would be tied to the inspections that have been going on, site inspections out of building standards, et cetera. And there have been a need to try to fill some positions there to increase the number of inspectors. Kind of a similar thing to EMS, in which we've had to have some people on overtime to get that inspection pace met appropriately. Trying to resolve that going forward too.
In response to that, I have also got a question for Mr. Hartzell, which is there going to be an expectation for need for a transfer since they've already spent more than 100% of their budgeted amount?
Yes, I expect that there would need to be a budget transfer probably from 02 to 06, because I expect that they would have available funds in 02 since they haven't filled those positions until right about now.
Do you have any idea when Mr. White is planning on coming forward with that, or I don't know if you've had any discussions?
I have not discussed with him, but I expect that that has to be soon.
Okay, and as long as we're here, I also am curious about, it looks like a rather large jump in Parks and Recreation from 34% at this date last year to 52% right now.
I need to look at that one a little more. I'm not sure what's driving that one.
Okay, yeah, if you could just let us know, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I want it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Just keep an eye on that. So how are we doing here with the pools and non-pool cash accounts?
There you see where our pool cash is at this point of the year. Again, explaining that looking at the Trexler Park budget, we're expecting we're going to get that reimbursement process very shortly. That will bring that back up to about a zero balance. The golf fund is still running about a negative 293,000. Everything else is pretty much at a pace that we would expect at this point of the year.
Any comments on the report? Anyway, you want to look at the vacancy report? We already talked about that.
Yeah, we did pretty much, and that's everything that's left in it.
Yeah, anything, anybody wants to talk about vacancy? Go ahead.
I have a couple questions, Mr. Chairman, thank you. On page 1, Mr. Hartzell, in the recreation program, 3435. So last year at this time, we were looking at about 73%, and we are at 56% at this point this year. Do we have an idea as to why there's such a significant drop in that?
I'd have to look at that one too.
Yeah, if you could get us an answer on that.
63,000 versus 50,000 so far this year. Yeah,
Right.
that's a bit of a drop.
Yeah, that's a rather large drop, so I'm curious about that. On page 2, so in the very first section, the fines and forfeitures, we seem to have a very significant drop in fines and forfeitures. We were at 88% last year, we're at 32% this year. Looking at going on district court, we were at 67% at this time last year, we're at 49%. Fines and restitution, 64%, we're at 56%. And parking authority reimbursement, we were at 100% at this point last year, and we're at 21%.
And that one's not going to change. That's the big issue, is that because of the revenue that has been, the way in which the revenue structure is there for the parking authority, that's gonna remain a hole, and that's gonna be the biggest hole that we're gonna encounter in the budget the rest of the year. What happens there, Councilman Robinson, is that once they get to the end of the year reconciliation process and they figure out exactly how much has to be left over to pay for debt, whatever revenues are left over at that point that do not seriously impair their cash balance going forward, that portion gets returned to the city. And for 2017, which was a very difficult year in terms of use, there was significant decreases in use of parking facilities that year. That's why we only ended up in January getting $102,000 cash amount at the end of the year. I think we're starting to see some robustness happen a little bit more in terms of parking fees. I know that especially as more of these office buildings come online and people come in, I think we're going to see we're going to see this improve significantly. But probably that one, if out of all the items in the budget, is going to be a noticeable hole for this year.
So I'm just, and I apologize if this is sort of a redundant question, but I'm having a hard time understanding, why is it that last year we were at 100% at this point in time, as opposed to 21? I'm just sort of, I guess I'm not quite understanding, I apologize.
The entirety of what we received from them had been received by July last year. That's $638,000, which would have included the end of payment for 2016. Would have been received by this point, and there was nothing new coming in the door.
Okay, right, that's where I was sort of having a lack of understanding then, because they had a relatively bad year last year. That's why we didn't really see anything come in the door at the beginning, and why we're falling so far behind.
Yes.
Okay, and you're saying you feel it's gonna stay pretty consistent for the rest of the year, so that we're not gonna get up to that, even close to that 750
I
budget?
understand that, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. I have one more question for you, Mr. Hartzell, let me just find it here. Okay, yes, on page... here we go, on page 7. Stormwater revenue, with the fact that we have 90% at this point, what's the plan for collection of any delinquent stormwater revenue? What's our plan to deal with that?
If it is similar to what we do with the solid waste fee, Councilman Robinson, I think we're going to give folks the remainder of this calendar year to be able to get up to that collection on their own, and that when we hit 2019, if there is still delinquent out there, when it comes to solid waste fund, we have an entity, Penn Credit, that we utilize at that point to collect the delinquencies. I think there's something similar to that in place for the stormwater fee, but I'm not remembering it at this point. So they'll have the remainder of this year to do it on their own, and then we will, once the calendar turns to January, pursue that with the help of creditors.
So in terms of anything that your department would have to do to reach out, it's basically,
Between now and December 31st.
and they have, are we reaching out to them again, or, okay.
Yeah,
I was just trying to see what type of a burden this was placing on your department.
No, we absolutely do everything we can to try to collect it in-house at this point of the year.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Hartzell. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ransom. Just a quick question on that. Isn't that collected with the taxes?
I'm sorry, say that.
Isn't that, the stormwater revenue collected with the taxes?
Oh, yeah, it is. The collection happens alongside of the property tax and the solid waste fee. But how we handle the delinquencies for each of those sources is a little bit different. When it comes to real estate tax, we go to the Lehigh County Tax Claim Bureau at the end of the calendar year and try to resolve things there. We use Penn Credit for the stormwater fees that are year late, and then I'm with the solid waste fees. And I think we've got something in place with the stormwater fee that may be they as well. I'm just not remembering it at the moment.
Yeah. So I told them would be, if you're late in the taxes, you're gonna be late in your stormwater.
Absolutely, and we will try to pursue as much as we can in-house for the remainder of the calendar year, but if we don't see anything by the 1st of January, it will be turned over to a collection agency.
Mr. Chairman, if I may. And I like the fact that we're giving them till next year, because this was implemented after many entities, nonprofits included, already had their budget done. And I mean, it's the same way with the typical homeowner. I mean, most homeowners budget things also, so I think we have to have a little bit of leeway on this one.
I agree. And, you know, the issue is, unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately, the way it is actually, the nonprofit organizations, they don't budget for things like this because they don't pay taxes.
Absolutely. I agree.
Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on this, Mr. Hartzell, I don't know if you would have this information out, but do you know what the breakdown of that 10% is, whether it's homeowners, for-profit businesses, nonprofits?
I do not know.
Okay, just because it seems like with a 90% take in, that seems like a very high number, and like we did pretty well, so, okay, thank you.
I agree that we did well. I just think we got to give a little
Oh,
leeway for those that.
And I agree, I'm just saying, it seems a lot of the nonprofits found a way to pay for it, so I think it's interesting.
If in fact.
Well, that's why I was curious.
All right, well, some small nonprofits probably don't even know they exist, quite frankly, on this, I mean. All right, anything else? Moving the vacancy factor, the vacancy report before,
Wait a minute,
anything else in that?
I want to answer a question if you asked.
Go right ahead, sir.
Staying in stormwater, I see there's 1.5 million. Is that about 15 people? Is that what you transferred into this group? What is it?
I mean,
What is the number?
I don't have that with me, but I can get that.
Take a guess.
It's in the,
it's in the budget book,
About
and I
20.
didn't bring that one
Is it
with me.
about 20 or?
it's about 20, I think
But
it's
this
in the
number,
budget book.
this is just wages, it doesn't include their health care, right?
Yeah, it does. If you're looking at 14 for pension and 16 for insurance, yes, it does include that.
Line 02 of page.
Oh, yeah, O2 is the wages.
15, 12, 1.5 million?
Yeah, that's how much in permanent wages was moved over, pretty much. There are some of that was brand new, but much of it was moved over from the general.
It includes health care?
Healthcare is item 16. Go down a little bit further.
Okay,
Insurance can go.
that top number is not, that's just wages.
That's just wages, yes, sir.
Okay, one more, page 11. When you go up here and look at the solid waste number, 485, and we have $9 million sitting there, is that correct?
Yeah, that's where their cash balance is at the end of July.
And we pay waste management, the bulk of this money is what, about 800,000 a month? We pay monthly, right?
Yeah, we pay regularly on that one, and we've reached the point at the end of July in which most of the revenue has come in the door for the year because it's collected alongside the property tax. So that balance will now start to drop for the remainder of the year because the revenue has pretty well come in for the year, and we will still have those expenditures going out the door.
If I did that, there'd be only $5 million left So we have about 4 or 5 million left.
That would
By the
be,
end of the year.
that's certainly where we're aiming at this point, and we just moved 640,000 over from the general fund.
We already, I mean, that's the money that we're supposed to pay.
Yeah, the 7-year loan.
Mr. Hershey?
Yes, thank you. If you look at the solid waste one again, why are some bills only like $84,000, bringing the bill for the future on $800,000? Is there a reason why we're paying less than what the buildings are? You look on their solid waste fund, other contracted services.
Other contracted services under
And some of the buildings are 84,000.
Okay,
Another one for 106,000. Usually, if the building is 800,000, is there a reason why we're not paying for the buildings?
No, we're definitely paying waste management at the time that we need to pay them. It may have been that the payment that happened for August might be coming in at the beginning of August and at the end of July, but we are paying waste management on a timely basis.
Well, how about February?
Yeah,
Or
sorry.
January, is it
There are some things that happen in the end of year statements that January only picks up occasionally. The things that are, it's in that mix between things that are charged to the end of the previous fiscal year and the one of the starting year that we get into. But I will say absolutely that we are paying waste management on time.
the stormwater question, do we pay a city share yet?
Yes, we have, that we didn't.
You know, it doesn't affect the city, it comes out of this pocket, goes in this pocket, so it doesn't make any difference.
It goes from the general fund to the stormwater fund, so it does make a difference, yes.
You know, one pocket to it. And, Mr. McLean, are you going to do something for the military people or disabled, where you and Mayor were just going to decide to do something for disabled veterans? That's being stormwater fee. They're exempt from the real estate taxes. So why should they keep paying stormwater fee? They can't, some of these people are disabled, Mr. McLean, you know, and they have a hard time meeting their commitment just to live, and then they're exempt from real estate taxes. But you guys are down on the ring order, you and Mayor were looking into maybe exempt those. Are you gonna follow through on that?
I'll follow through with the mayor on that one.
Well, when he was here for the city council, you remember when we're discussing exempting disabled veterans, because they're exempt from real estate taxes.
He and I both voted against the stormwater fee. He and I both voted against the stormwater fee.
I know, and I hope the veteran.
Well,
Thank you.
I don't have a problem with it. Accepting it.
And okay, and then, when I'm looking at the parking authority, Mr. Robinson's concerned about it, I think at the parking authority, council that look at the parking authority at their expenses, what they have. I think the executive director earns more than the police chief does, am I correct on that? I mean, it's wrong, I think they're.
When I was chief, I don't know about today.
They're always been making more than what is.
I think you have to look at the parking, do we need them as an operating authority? We can maybe use them as a financial authority, a lot of cities do, and the operating portion would be on the police department. And like we did years ago, we had them on the police department, we had no problem with it. But then we started building parking decks and then we put them the way we're today. But I think we have council that look at it. I mean, Mr. Robinson's concerned about it, is have them as a financial authority, and just put them on the police
Well, we
department.
can look at that again. We
We
can,
looked at that before.
yeah, we can look at it again, see what's going on. You know. So, thank you. Just to point out, Mr. Hanlon just told me there are 26 positions in the, stormwater, department.
Thank you, sir.
26. 24, 26. All right, anything else? If not, I will consider, oh, hold on a second, we got something about discussion here, what is this? Okay, oh, all right,
Just did.
yeah, okay. If not, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you, have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.